Good morning and welcome to Northern Ireland Planner Live, which has been organised by the RTPI Northern Ireland with support from Landmark Chambers and Arup, who are the event sponsors, and my thanks to all involved. It's been a very special week of discussion and debate looking at how planners can seize the chance for change. In a post-pandemic world. The theme underpinning the week has been how infrastructure can be better integrated with land use planning. Today's webinar is focused on sharing approaches to delivering integrated infrastructure. But a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speakers. If you are tweeting, please can you use the hashtag NIPlanLive2020. If you have questions for our speakers during the session, please can you submit these by using the question function, and I'll pick these up after we've heard from each of our speakers. So to briefly introduce our three speakers for today, and there are much more detailed biographies on the conference website. Firstly, we've got John Fudge. John is the head of planning policy team in the Welsh Government and is responsible for the publication of national planning policy. He is currently leading work on the preparation of the first national development framework, and his particular policy interests lie in decarbonisation and housing. And we also have Stefano Smith, Stefano Smith Planning. Stefano has successfully advised, negotiated and delivered a range of complex land and development and infrastructure projects. He was the project director leading a multidisciplinary team in the Infrastructure Charging Mechanism Research Project commissioned by the Scottish Government. And that research examined the potential for developing Scotland's infrastructure funding mechanism, the infrastructure levy, which has subsequently been included as a sunset clause in the Planning Scotland Act 2019. And then we also have Susan Claris. Susan is a transport planner and an anthropologist. She is Arup's global champion for active transport, and she led the report Towards a Walking World and co-authored the recent Cycling for Everyone report with Sustrans. Susan gave evidence to the UK Government Transport Committee inquiry into active travel and is the Vice President and a trustee of Living Streets, the UK charity for everyday walking. So having said that, what I'd like to do now is hand over to our first speaker, John Fudge, who will talk about the maturing of devolution in Wales with regard to the planning system. And John will be focusing on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the Planning Wales Act, and show how Wales has taken greater responsibilities and has mainstreamed sustainable development. Over to you, John.
John, sorry to interrupt. Your microphone is muted. Can you unmute it, please?
Can you hear me now? Does that work? Apologies for that. First glitch of the day. Yes, I was saying thank you very much, Sue, for the very kind introduction. What I was going to do today is talk about our experiences here in Wales with regard to the alignment of strategic infrastructure and the planning system. It's been a very long 20-year story that we have in Wales, and I think I need to sort of share the experiences that we've had with regard to devolution and how that has influenced and shaped the way in which we think of the planning system and the alignment of infrastructure here in Wales. So let me go to the first slide. I think it's important here for me to draw a little pen picture of the story of devolution in Wales, and how over the last 20 years it's been a journey to increasing autonomy and increasing devolution. Back in 1997, there was a referendum which the Welsh people agreed that there should be a Welsh Assembly. And it was established in 1998 through the Government of Wales Act. I think it's fair to say that the creation of the Assembly back in those days represented an important but limited release of powers from the UK Government and the Secretary of State for Wales. It led to the creation of the National Assembly for Wales, and 20 subjects, 20 particular topics were released to Cardiff as matters for devolved competence, albeit there was no primary legislative powers associated with it. And so in the early days of the government, it was basically a mechanism for distributing funding. In 2006, the Government of Wales Act recognised that there needed to be a formal separation of the Assembly and the government, and the Welsh Assembly government came into being, and it gave enhanced powers to make strange, I think by our terms today, strange legal powers called Assembly measures, which were a made in Wales solution to the fact that there was no primary legislative responsibilities for, as we now know, for the Welsh government. So there was this process called Assembly measures that was introduced. I should say as well, it's important that from the outset, town and country planning was one of the devolved topics that's always been in the responsibility of the Welsh government. I think 2010 was a bit of a landmark in terms of the devolution here in Wales, where there was another referendum where people in Wales were asked about whether the National Assembly should be given more mature lawmaking powers, and to put it onto a footing that people could recognise it as being a proper democratic government of Wales. And that referendum was quite handsomely won by the government, and following up that, the 2014 Wales Act was a bit of a landmark, I think, because for the first time the Welsh government was given fiscal powers to actually raise taxes, albeit in a limited way, particularly with regards to stamp duty and landfill tax. As the devolution process has matured, two really important pieces of legislation were enacted in 2015, and I will talk more about those throughout the course of this presentation. The Wellbeing of Future Generation Act and the Planning Wales Act, both 2015, both progressed almost hand in glove with each other through the National Assembly, and they form the context for a lot of what we do in planning in Wales. But just to sort of as a footnote now, in 2017, the most recent Wales Act, if you refer back to what I was saying in the early days of the of devolution here in Wales, where the Welsh government operated by dint of things being let go by the UK government in very specific fields, the model has been completely reversed, and so we now have a reverse power model in Wales, where the Welsh government is responsible for everything in Wales apart from the list of topics contained in the 2017 Act, which are retained by the UK government. So there's a complete volte-face in terms of the power relationship between Cardiff and Whitehall here. And the 2017 Act also gave more powers to the Welsh government with regard to transport, energy and the natural environment. So in essence, the trajectory of devolution in Wales has been one of increasing autonomy and a sort of a journey that we're still on, really. So as I say, two seminal pieces of legislation in 2015, Wellbeing of Future Generations and the Planning Wales Act. I'd like to focus a little bit more on both of those, if I may. So as a sort of background to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, I think there was a clear recognition in Wales, as there is in many other places, that people and public sector in particular were thinking in the short term. They were thinking in financial and budgetary cycles, and there was a lack of long-term strategic thinking about public services in Wales. This was played out with the clear sort of evidence that organisations were still working in silos. There was a lack of communication between the public sectors, and they were very often coming up with separate solutions to the same problem, which was incredibly frustrating frustrating and incredibly wasteful of resources as well. There was also a greater awareness of the connections between the environment, economy and society. From the outset, the Welsh Government was tasked with promoting sustainable development, and this needed to be enhanced more thoroughly through the public sector in Wales. Wales is a very small country, but it's also a very diverse country with different needs, different cultural, linguistic, economic and social requirements across the country, and there was a recognition that some parts of Wales were not being included to the extent that they should have been, and there was a lack of consideration of some of the long-term structural trends in the world that were happening at the time. So that really lay behind the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in 2015. And at its core, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales has 7 wellbeing goals. These goals are shown in this diagram here. They are intended to be, you can see as a jigsaw, they are interlinked and they are comprehensive and cohesive, and they are supposed to be seen as in totality. These goals are binding on all public sector organisations here in Wales, and they have been really seminal in changing the approach to the delivery of governance and public services in Wales. All public sector organisations, whether it's the NHS, local authorities, Welsh Government, are required to show how they are delivering against these goals. And this is overseen by the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner here in Wales, who oversees the process, but also supports and helps with the delivery of it. The goals are quite clear there. They're about a prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales, healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a Wales of vibrant culture and a thriving Welsh language, and importantly, a globally responsible Wales. As I say, these are enshrined in the legislation, and they are the core of the planning of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and they form the overarching sustainable development credentials of the Welsh Government, and are really important for the planning system here in Wales. As I said, following hot on the heels of the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, by a matter of months, was the Planning Wales Act in 2015. And the Planning Wales Act sets out the statutory purpose for the planning system in Wales and explicitly links the requirement to carry out sustainable development under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So the two pieces of legislation go hand in glove in terms of the promotion of sustainable development. And I think that's really, really important sort of milestone for us, and it's really something which informs our thinking here in Wales. The Planning Wales Act also required the production of a national development framework. The national development framework will be an all Wales strategic plan. It will have development plan status when it is published. And importantly, the Planning Wales Act says that plans that nest beneath the NDF must be in conformity with it, and if they're not, then they will need to be modified to reflect what the NDF says. So it's a really important piece of work here, which we're currently engaged with in terms of aligning the planning system to the Wellbeing Future Generations Act. So the strategic planning thinking going on in the NDF will be thinking about where jobs and services should be located, what types of infrastructure we need over the next 20 years. It's a 20-year plan, I should have said, and where development, importantly, should be avoided and protected areas, and the role of places across Wales. These are all things that are being influenced as we speak by the production of the National Development Framework. We're creating a new hierarchy of development plans here in Wales. At the top will be the NDF. Currently at the bottom, there are the local development plans produced by 25 local planning authorities here in Wales. And the bit in the middle is the little bit of a void at the moment, but it's the strategic or the regional planning area, which since 2015, the provisions of the Act allowed for SDPs to be prepared. None have been forthcoming. Politicians in Wales are getting a little bit tired, I think, of waiting for these things. So there's currently some legislation going before the Senate or the Welsh Parliament, as we speak, called the Local Government and Elections Bill, which will mandate the production of strategic development plans. So there is a re-engineering of the architecture of the development plan system in Wales based on this hierarchy of plans. So as I say, we consulted on the draft National Development Framework in August last year. This diagram explains the relationship of the NDF. On the left-hand side, you'll see the external sources. You'll see the legislative context that I described earlier, the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act and the Government of Wales Acts, etc. Clearly, we are asked and tasked with the delivery of the programme for government. So these are things which overarch and will influence the content of the NDF. There are other influences, such as the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales, which has been established as an independent body to advise on the provision of infrastructure in Wales, and also other strategies of the government, such as the transport strategy, etc. I won't go into the detail. But on the right-hand side, you will see the influence in terms of regional planning and on local planning in terms of what local authorities are expected to do here in Wales. This is the key diagram that we consulted on as part of the draft NDF last summer. You will see that we've identified a number of national growth areas shown by these hatched lines. The essence of the NDF is actually based on sustainable development and decarbonisation, linking back again to the Wellbeing and Future Generations legislation. And the idea is very much about trying to get the promotion of active travel, of public transport, of reducing the reliance on private motor vehicles, etc. And so we've identified opportunities for national growth in these areas as the sort of drivers for change within Wales, supplemented by these areas which are shown as sort of green slabs here. They're regionally important areas. We are, in this version of the NDF, we've identified 3 regions. There's the North, the Mid and Southwest, and Southeast Wales. That's caused quite a lot of controversy, and it's something that we will have to look at, I think, as we take the NDF forward, as to whether we've got that right. Clearly one of the purposes of consulting on the strategy was to elicit views across Wales. And for the first time, we are actually talking about the introduction of green belts to shape and control growth in certain parts of Wales. So the strategy is really very much driven by decarbonisation, very much driven by the recognition that different parts of Wales need different solutions, and allowing for the plans that would nest underneath the NDF, be they SDPs or LDPs, to actually fill in the gaps. This very strategic document, there's hardly any places mentioned because it's the role of the strategic and the local plans to actually understand the detailed workings of places far more than the national cut that we've taken here in the NDF. As I say, there are 3 regions currently identified, and so I've mentioned that already, with different policies and different ideas for how those areas work because of their completely different functional relationships. The relationship in North Wales to the northwest of England, for example, is evident with the A55. Southeast Wales has links clearly to London and Bristol and the West Country, but it is much more sort of self-contained and an economically cohesive unit in that respect. So we need to evidence different approaches here through this approach. I mentioned how the Wellbeing Future Generation Act has influenced everything. Here's an example in practice. Decarbonisation, as I mentioned, was really important consideration. And one of the things that we were very keen to do through the National Development Framework was to promote the efficient rollout of renewable energy in Wales. Wales is one of the best endowed parts of Northern Europe with regard to wind and its coastline, etc. And we needed an approach that recognised that the opportunities for decarbonisation and renewable energy in Wales. And so we identified the least constrained areas of Wales, shown in this map, and we consulted on some policies regarding how we would promote renewable energy in these areas. The evidence base that we've established here is really important. It's really important because it is going to sort of influence not only the planning policy, but our energy policy as well. This has been co-produced by colleagues within the Welsh Government with regards to energy deployment. And it's really important, and we hope that we will be able to give a rational and clear policy context for the consenting of renewable energy projects in Wales through this work. Like everything else in the world, the COVID pandemic and the lockdown threw us a massive curveball with regards to the production of the National Development Framework. We had anticipated that we were going to introduce the NDF into the Senedd for consideration and scrutiny back in April. That wasn't possible. We had to retrench, and we had to think about what we were going to do whilst the Senedd, well, it wasn't meeting for quite a while. It now is, and we've now charted out a new timeline for the production of the National Development Framework. So next week we will be introducing the NDF for consideration by the Assembly, the Senedd, and they, under the Planning Wales Act, have 60 sitting days to scrutinise what we submit. They then submit their views and comments back to the Welsh Government, and our Minister and the First Minister are on record as saying that they intend to publish the NDF in the spring of next year. So the timescale has been changed and condensed as well in certain areas because of the pandemic, but we are still on track, and this has been identified in the continuity plan for the government as being one of the important considerations and one of the important things that the government will deliver during this current term. I've talked quite a lot about the production of the NDF, but that shouldn't mean that we have, I shouldn't imply that we haven't been doing other things as well. National planning policy in Wales was completely overhauled at the end of 2018 to put the principles of placemaking at its heart. And this has stood us in good stead, I think, in terms of the planning system. And we are very much see the principles set out in PPW, the placemaking principles, as offering the opportunities for how we should respond in the long term to the COVID pandemic. So in July, we published Building Better Places, which basically highlighted the importance of placemaking in Wales to the response that we take for the long-term responses to the pandemic. And I think, and I genuinely believe that the decisions that we make in the next year or so will influence a long-term thought here. So we have an opportunity now to start thinking about how we want Wales to shape and grow. The production of the NDF and the production of this work as well are very much seminal to the production of it. So I think I've had my 15 minutes of glory. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. Thank you very much for listening. I'd be happy to sort of take any questions, later on.
Sue, can you turn your mic on? Sorry. Your mic is not on.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah. Carry on.
Super. Right, well that was my thing of the morning then, wasn't it? So thank you very much, John, for that fascinating insight into the changing and maturing Welsh planning system. I'm very conscious of time, so we'll move on very quickly now to our second speaker, Stefano Smith, to tell us a little bit more about Scotland's infrastructure first approach and the various mechanisms for capturing value to fund infrastructure. Over to you, Stefano.
Stefano, you need to turn your microphone on.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, John, for a very thorough presentation in terms of the Welsh context. The focus of my presentation is to outline the existing and emerging approaches to funding the delivery of infrastructure in Scotland. I'll specifically consider planning obligations, that is Section 75 agreements, as well as the potential application of the infrastructure levy, which is identified as a sunset clause in the Planning Scotland Act 2019. In considering these approaches, I will seek to tease out some of the key issues and challenges in the implementation of these infrastructure funding mechanisms. I have extensive, relevant and recent experience in the funding of infrastructure. As the Chair made reference earlier, I led a multidisciplinary team in undertaking research on behalf of Scottish Government on infrastructure charging mechanisms in 2017, resulting in the inclusion of an infrastructure levy sunset clause in the Planning Scotland Act. I'm currently supporting an LSE-led research team examining the value, impact and incidence of developer contributions in Scotland for Scottish Government. The research is to help inform the government's review of the effectiveness of existing mechanisms such as planning obligations for securing contributions from developers towards infrastructure. Our work will provide much needed evidence on obligations in Scotland and how it's being spent. It will also look at the practical issues associated with planning obligations, including the relationship with development plans and their impact on development viability and infrastructure delivery. The Scottish Government has said that the research will help to inform future policy development in relation to planning, funding and delivery of infrastructure required to create high quality places. I'm also an experienced practitioner in the negotiation of Section 75 agreements. My brief presentation is structured around three main sections. Firstly, to consider developer contributions in Scotland. This section outlines what can be learned from publicly available material about the rationale of the contributions approach and the policy and practice on which the system is based. Secondly, to consider the infrastructure levy charging mechanism included in the Act. And finally, to consider some of the key issues and challenges in the funding of integrated infrastructure. Policy relating to developer contributions has evolved in Scotland as it has done in England. It was originally a mechanism to be used specifically to mitigate the immediate impacts of new developments. Over time, it has evolved as more broadly based approach to securing funding for local and now more sub-regional infrastructure. In addition, obligations evolved to secure contributions towards wider community needs, especially for new affordable homes, by making land available for them in areas where market activity was making this difficult. Developer contributions can also support the following objectives. They can improve economic efficiency by getting developers to pay for some of the infrastructure required to support new developments. They can improve equity and fairness by capturing some of the unearned increment arising from planning consent and using this to fund community needs, including affordable homes, and they can raise income for public spending in ways consistent with taxation principles. The main policy mechanism today in both Scotland and England is planning obligations by obliging developers to fund some of the infrastructure required to support their new developments, mitigating impacts and contributing to community needs. In Scotland, development is the most significant area of change within the Planning Scotland Act. The Act changed the form, content and process for preparing and adopting plans, aligning better with wider policy making at a national, regional and local scale, including improving housing delivery and infrastructure first approach to development. The significance of developer contributions for the funding and delivery of infrastructure was emphasised in a report by the Scottish Futures Trust in 2019. Now, this slide illustrates the infrastructure first approach. What the infrastructure first approach means identifying and addressing the infrastructure capacity and requirements arising from development, including their impacts and needs on a combined basis at a local, strategic and national basis. Infrastructure and related activity may range from elements such as land remediation and preparation through to delivering schools and community facilities to roads and roundabouts, and newer types of assets such as low carbon solutions and digital connectivity. There is essentially a broad definition of infrastructure and how these support wider activity. At the core of the infrastructure first approach is the concept of bringing together a collaborative culture which inherently understands the relationship between plan making, the principles of place, and the funding and financing commitments needed to bring forward coordinated delivery. This flow diagram captures the infrastructure first approach and what it seeks to achieve. The approach identifies that infrastructure delivery sits across the national, strategic, or regional and local levels, and these all impact and shape development of place. Place, as highlighted in this slide, is intrinsically linked to infrastructure. This includes initially understanding the physical infrastructure capacity and assets already in situ, coordinating future strategic investment priorities and alignment with key partners. Why is an infrastructure levy required? This slide illustrates that essentially there are three strategic levels of infrastructure. At the highest level, the national level infrastructure investment is funded through national funding, infrastructure investment plan and national planning framework. At the lowest level, at the local site-specific infrastructure investment, this is funded through Section 75 planning obligations or other methods, such as Section 69 or Section 48 in Scotland. It relates to site-specific infrastructure, funding to mitigate impacts not covered by the levy. What we have is a middle area, the strategic regional infrastructure investment, that in Scotland was unclear in terms of how that level of strategic infrastructure would be funded. And that was the basis for the infrastructure charging mechanism research that the Scottish Government instructed in 2017, which has translated itself into an infrastructure levy to fund strategic regional infrastructure. So why is an infrastructure levy required? The report of the independent review of the Scottish planning system, commissioned by Scottish Government in 2015, is clear about the importance of and increasing difficulty in securing investment in essential infrastructure to support development, stating that our view has concluded that linking infrastructure with planned development is the most significant challenge for the Scottish planning system at this time. It also outlines concerns about the ability of planning obligations to support infrastructure development, where and when it's required to facilitate development. So what does the Act allow with regard to the infrastructure levy. The Act gives Scottish ministers the power to establish an infrastructure levy. This power is additional to planning obligations rather than replacing them. Details of the levy scheme will be set out in regulations, which will be the subject to parliamentary scrutiny. The Act defines the infrastructure levy as one which is payable to a local authority, relates to development wholly or partly within the authority's area, and will be invested in infrastructure projects by the local authority. The Act defines infrastructure as follows: communications, transport, drainage, sewerage and flood defence systems for the supply of water and energy, educational and medical facilities, and other places for recreation. Scottish ministers have the power to vary this definition through regulations. Scottish ministers also have the power to issue and vary and revoke guidance to local authorities on how the infrastructure levy powers should be used and the income generated spent. Guidance could apply to all authorities, some or just one. Local authorities should be required to have regard to the guidance when using their infrastructure levy powers. So, in terms of advantages and disadvantages of planning obligations, increasingly planning stakeholders have raised concerns about the growing scope and complexity of planning obligations, including the time and costs involved in negotiation, the uncertainties they generate, the fairness of only covering a few large applications, and the openness to public scrutiny. Notwithstanding the criticisms, the current system has two main advantages. Firstly, fairness, because a developer can only be asked to contribute towards infrastructure required for the particular development, although this creates problems for large and complex schemes where each individual project contributes cumulatively to what is needed. And secondly, flexibility, because there is no rigid rules, particularly important where the viability of the development and therefore the likelihood of it proceeding might require the amount of developer contribution to be reduced. But there are also disadvantages, including a lack of public transparency, inconsistent approaches by local authorities, lack of certainty because of reliance on negotiations in relation to individual projects, delays due to these negotiations about the amount of developer contributions and to the drafting of legal agreements. The link between development and infrastructure results in infrastructure delivery in strong market areas, not necessarily where it is most needed, including in areas where infrastructure is needed to stimulate new development. So that concludes my brief presentation. Happy to address questions in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefano. A really interesting insight into the work that you've been doing in Scotland. And now for our final speaker, Susan Claris. Susan will be focusing on place and integrating inclusive active travel. And this is particularly needed in Northern Ireland, where people tend to travel by car, and with the exception of Belfast, where there've recently been change, active travel has not been well developed, although there is now a push for that from the current minister. So over to you, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a joy to be here today, and hopefully I have unmuted my mic and you can hear me. So I will briefly run through some information on active travel into developments. I try and use personal photos where possible. That's a photograph of my partner's niece and nephew, and I think those are the sorts of streets that we need to have where children can walk along like that. So what I want to talk briefly about is the journeys we make. I always think that's an important reminder. Run through some of the benefits of walking and cycling very briefly, and then illustrate with some actions and case studies. And the photograph there is a crossing in Utrecht, which is a nice, colourful crossing. So a reminder of the journeys we make. Ooh, it's going forward too many. If we look at how we travel, we can see at the moment walking is already a substantive mode of transport. So 27%, over a quarter of trips are walked. They only account for 3% of total distance, which is not surprising. And cycling is 2%, 1% of distance. These stats are from the National Travel Survey, which largely cover England. I haven't got the Northern Ireland stats, but I'm talking about it from my perspective, but I imagine they'll be fairly similar, and really what I'm focusing on are the themes, not the details of the numbers. And the graph on the right shows for the period since the early 1970s up until now, it's been fairly consistent in terms of the number of trips we make and the hours we spend traveling. What has changed is the distance that we travel. But I said in essence, we're making similar numbers of trips. And the key thing really for me is that most journeys are really short. A quarter of all journeys we make are under a mile and 2/3 are under 5 miles. But if we look at the first bar, which is journeys under 1 mile, we can see that there's nearly some 20% of those are made by the car, and the majority of journeys 1 to 5 miles are also made by the car. So there's a lot of potential for active travel. And also the why we travel. As transport planners, we tend to focus on commuting, on the journey to work, I think largely because those are the journeys we make and we tend to design in our own image. But actually the most common trip purposes, half of trips are for leisure and shopping, even with all the online stuff. Obviously this is pre-COVID, but half of all trips are for leisure and shopping. And if we look at the right-hand graph, which shows car trips, we can see commuting is down there at 15%. Again, half of trips are leisure and shopping, but how much do we actually focus on those when we are planning developments? And in terms of cars, we have the situation we are buying more vehicles and we are using them less. So if we look at the shape of the graph on the left, the upward trajectory shows that the number of vehicles we have has been increasing over the years, and in GB we're now up to about 38 million vehicles. But actually we're using them less. The amount of miles an average car does, and I think if you ask most people, they'd probably say average car mileage, maybe 10,000, 12,000 a year. It's actually down to 7,600 miles per day, miles per year, sorry. So an average of just over 20 miles per day. And that's why we see that cars are parked for the majority of the time, typically quoted as sort of 96% of the time. Use it for an hour, park it for 23 hours. And also just want to touch on the rising use of large vehicles in urban areas, sales of SUVs. So in Europe, 1 in 3 vehicles sold is an SUV, and the number of SUVs far outstrip the number of sales of electric vehicles. And the relevance for me to this is that SUVs are twice as likely to kill pedestrians if they're in a collision because they hit the upper part of your body where all the vital organs are. They emit more particulates because they're heavier, they take up more space. There is evidence to show that driver behaviour is poorer. They have a sort of tank mentality. They feel safe inside their vehicle and they're not aware of other road users. And there is increasing evidence on the link between pedestrian fatalities and engine size. So there's a real disadvantage to people wanting to walk and cycle from these rising use of large vehicles. So that's sort of the context in terms of stats. In terms of the benefits of walking and cycling, I think it's really important to emphasise because this isn't a soft measure, a nice to have. It isn't greenwash. And I think I always start off with what some of the economic benefits are for walking and cycling. And there's strong evidence coming through now that people who walk to high streets spend 40% more money than car drivers do. In the past, it's always been thought most important to address the needs of car owners and to provide parking, but it's the people who walk there who spend more. And high street walking, cycling and public realming improvements can boost retail sales by up to 30%. And I think that's really important at this time of COVID with the way that town centres are struggling. And there are benefits to business. If people walk to work or people use active travel to work, they're happier. So it leads to increased employee retention and reduced cost to businesses. And people who are physically active, employees who are physically active, take 27% fewer sick days than their colleagues a year. If you said to most businesses, I can reduce your absenteeism rate by 25%, people would think you were lying or they'd want to know how to do it. So there are real strong benefits for businesses. And there are social benefits for people. So if streets are quieter, low traffic neighbourhoods, there's more social interaction between neighbours, people know each other, children can play out, they can walk, scoot or cycle to school. There are public realm benefits to the whole community from things like street trees and providing benches. And really they just make places so safer and healthier for everybody. And the health benefits for people. So if you lower the traffic, there's lower levels of air pollution, but also it allows residents to build exercise into their daily routines, and that's a really strong benefit. And the graph here is from Public Health England, which shows the benefits of regular exercise. And what is increasingly aware is that it isn't going to the gym once a week or playing football or something. If you can get those 2 10-minute bursts into your daily activity, walking or cycling, then there are huge benefits that come. So a reduction in cognitive decline of 40%, a reduction in depression of 48%, all-cause mortality 30%. It really is sort of the wonder drug, and it's as simple as 2 10-minute bursts of activity a day. And there are climate benefits. If people use car less, they reduce carbon emissions. That can create space for street trees, for rain gardens, for pocket parks, which all helps in terms of biodiversity, flood mitigation, and creating change. So there's an enormous amount of benefit of actually providing for active travel, encouraging people to walk and to cycle. So how do we do it in terms of our developments? What are the case studies? And for me, the key thing is this putting people and active travel first. Always start off with this upside down pyramid where we have walking in all its forms, which includes people using wheelchairs, people with sticks, children on scooters. So put walking first. That is the most important mode, I think, as a mode in its own right, but also as a component of all other modes. If you're using public transport or cycling or driving at some point in your journey, you will also be walking. So walking at the top. Cycling next, again in its most inclusive form, looking at the various different types of bikes, cargo bikes, family bikes, etc. Then public transport, then taxi, freight and servicing and deliveries, and put private vehicles at the bottom of that pyramid. Not to say they're not allowed, but it's important, I think, to set up that priority. But actually, doing the best stuff for walking and cycling infrastructure is not enough. For me, there also has to be a reduction in the dominance of traffic. I refer to this as transport gluttony, which is things like parking on footways, engine idling, going through red lights, driving at inappropriate speeds. All of these things make the environment unpleasant for people who wish to use active travel. So I think it's important to have the 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in urban areas. It's about having parking controls, and I believe there should be forms of national road pricing to actually deter those really short journeys that could be made by other means. And it's also vitally important in active travel to be inclusive. We've just undertaken a piece of work with Sustrans, which looked at underrepresented groups in cycling, which include women, older people, people from ethnic minorities, disabled people, and people at risk of deprivation. So you can really see the only group not there, apart from children, is sort of white men aged 20 to 50, who are the dominant demographic in cycling. And I was overjoyed yesterday morning to take this photograph. It's not a part of hipster London. I'm based in a small village called Sandgate on the south coast of England, which has a population of 5,000 people. And as I popped out to the shops yesterday morning before starting work, these two women were sitting there on a bench having a chat. You can see the one woman has a tricycle, and for me, that's an absolute example of how it should be. And our report on cycling for everyone had 3 key recommendations: that we need to increase representation in governance and really embed inclusivity in walking and cycling strategies and plans. We need to create better places for everyone to walk and cycle. We can't just design our infrastructure around the typical sporty cyclist, and we need to give welcome and support for all people to walk and cycle. And some of that is about behaviours, it's about fear, it's about harassment and intimidation. So this isn't just infrastructure, there's some really important information here about behaviours. So what I want to conclude with are some case studies, examples of where active travel is being considered in developments. And they range from the really large, the master plans, the example here of Meridian Water, which is a major development in North London. And that was really about putting healthy streets at the heart of the proposals. Transport for London has their healthy streets indicators with the circle with the 10 colours there, which are places where people want to walk and cycle, which are not too noisy, where people feel safe. So this was at the heart of the proposals. Then it was about having mixed uses, located within walking, cycling distance to meet everyday needs, a sort of idea of the 15-minute city or neighbourhood that you're hearing talked about at the moment. It's about the provision of high quality and direct walking and cycling infrastructure, so it is the shortest route. It's about having a public transport strategy. In London, half of all walking is to do with public transport. And in terms of road users, it's about having areas which are car-free development and limited vehicular access for things like servicing and blue badge only. So active travel can be at the very large scale of the master plans, but it can also be at the much smaller scale. So, for example, we're doing work in Bold Street in Liverpool at the moment to put in parklets, which will help with social distancing and add greenery and make the street a nicer place. Bold Street is a lovely little street full of independent retailers that had too many vehicles down it. Now it's being replaced with areas where people can walk, they can ride their bikes, they can actually sit and have a chat, they can have a drink. It's changed the whole nature. So some of these improvements can be really small. It can be as little as one parking space, which can actually help to improve active travel. And it can be in terms of interchanges. So, for example, we've been doing work at Edinburgh Waverley Station at the moment, which includes significant active travel interventions around the station. So it includes pedestrianising one of the main streets fronting the station, it includes segregated cycle lanes, and it includes cycle parking spaces. So it applies at the station level. And then, whoops, why don't you want to move on? And also active travel can come about as part of other schemes. So one of my favourite examples is our Greener Grangetown project in Cardiff, which started off as a sustainable urban drainage project, which looked at putting in rain gardens. And then it was like, well, actually, what else can we do with the streets at the same time? So modal filters have gone in to take out through traffic. There's traffic calming, there's pedestrian crossings, public realm improvements, and Wales's first cycle street. And this was done very much from a community co-design approach. And the scheme enables more journeys by active modes. It creates resilient, greener and more attractive schemes. And then the last one I want to finish on, I thought I'd go for a Belfast one. So work that's been done in East Belfast on the Conswater Community Greenway, which is 16 kilometres of cycle and walkways, including a new 9-kilometre linear park. And this really, for me, this emphasises the point about connecting developments. We mustn't look at a development with its own footprint. We need to think how it connects to other developments. What is the space around the development? And the project there supports community cohesion, economic development, improvements in public health, cleaner rivers, and greater flood resilience. So I've rushed through that a bit to try and gain a bit more time for questions, but hand back to Sue for the question session, please.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was really, really interesting. And I think there's been some tremendous takeaways for me from all three presentations. And what's also interesting is that a number of themes have emerged from the various webinars this week, which actually have been picked up in today's session. So themes like spaces and places that work for everyone, the need for more cycling and walking, a recognition, and John touched on this in terms of the constraints associated with the numbers that live outside towns and cities, the challenge of mixed-use development, partnership and collaboration, and the infrastructure element, all of which are themes that have, as I say, come out across the week and very much today. So I've got a quick question for Stefano, if I may, before I pick up a question from Bert Bailey for Susan. So a quick question for Stefano. How much money is collected from developer contributions?
Thank you for that question, Sue. Obviously, that is core to our current research for Scottish Government to assess the value, impact and incidence of developer contributions in Scotland. However, an estimate was made earlier by Nathaniel Litchfield study in 2016, which looked at the period for 2014 and 15 on developer contributions, based on extrapolating data from 10 of Scotland's major house builders, which suggested a rising curve that would achieve about 83.7 million would be raised on Section 75 contributions for that year. Now, of this total, 60% or around 46.8 million was towards affordable homes and 16% for school provision and 27% for a range of community facilities, and then the balance being for sport and open space provision. So the affordable homes contribution enabled just under 4,500 new homes to be built, of which a fifth were built directly by the house builders and the rest by the local authorities. Now, in terms of the infrastructure levy, as part of the team that I led back in 2017, This suggested that by calculating a residual land value on annualized basis, only 230 million was annually available for affordable housing and infrastructure, of which it estimated that about 130 million was then collected via Section 75. So essentially, it's assumed that the infrastructure levy has the potential of generating about £75 million per year towards non-local infrastructure, which is comparable to the developer contributions. So, albeit not a significant amount of funding in their own right, when you put it within the cocktail of funding mechanisms, it would make about a 3 to 5% contribution.
Thank you very much. We've got one question from Bert Bailey, which I wanted to put to Susan. And the reason I put the one to Stefano first is just give Susan a break after having presented and just a chance to think about this. So, Susan, it's a question for you. It's the importance of segregating walking and cycling routes from other traffic and indeed from each other is well documented. How can older cities and towns in Northern Ireland, often planned to accommodate the horse and cart, be retro-planned to promote modes of travel which are seen to be difficult in our climate and often terrain?
Thank you, Sue. Thanks for that question, Bert. Yeah, I think retrofitting is far more important than looking at new developments because we have the majority of our built urban fabric and it will be around for years to come. And it can be done. It's all about reducing the dominance of cars and short journeys and through traffic rather than actually providing new infrastructure because there isn't the space. So my own area in London, most of the development was around the 1860s. What's happening in the borough now, I said, is they're putting in low traffic neighbourhoods, which they're referring to as people-friendly streets. And it's on the basis that if you can get rid of the through traffic and just keep the street had to have access for the people that live there and their deliveries and their friends, the traffic levels reduce so much that you don't need to provide additional space for walking and cycling. People can just use the streets because, as I said, the traffic levels are low and the traffic going there is travelling at a slow speed. And there is, I'm not familiar with all the Northern Ireland examples, but there's some great examples where places have been doing this for some time. And one of my favourites is Pontevedra in northwest Spain, which is a small city of 80,000 people. And they started this process back in 1999. And so there's a good body of evidence there that shows how pollution has gone down, collisions have gone down. Critically, the population has gone up, where surrounding towns have seen a decrease in population, including childhood population. And also the mayor there was re-elected for the 6th time last year. So it is a very popular thing with voters, which I think is one of my favourite examples. The climate and the terrain. Climate is often cited as a problem, but I actually think, I mean, there's the adage, there's no bad weather for walking, it's just having the wrong clothes. And, you know, I think a lot of the time, climate is not the deterrent that people think it is. I walk to work when I used to go to work in the office every day, you know, regardless of the weather. Yes, the southeast of England has a slightly better climate, but if it rains, I stick up an umbrella. You know, it isn't that big barrier. Terrain can be more of a hindrance, but then things like electric cycles can start to help. They have cost implications, but I think it's important to look for the positives.
Yes, just one minor point. I've been accepted on the master's programme at the University of Glasgow on urban analytics, and one of the modules on that is about retrofitting developments to respond to future cities agenda. So I'm extremely reassured by the fact that there is a huge body of work being developed academically and research pieces. And what's critically important is to marry that academic research into a practical application.
Thank you. Another question that's just come in, and if I can put this one to John, if that's all right. John, how can planners persuade, cajole, ensure that engineers and economists think about, maybe you might want to extend that to politicians as well, think about the quality of place when making decisions on funding infrastructure and the type of infrastructure? It's just popped up, so it's a bit of a quick off to you.
Right. I think that is something that we recognise across the devolved administrations. It's certainly something that is live and a very pertinent question to ask. I think part of it is actually having the confidence to go with the policies. You know, here in Wales, we're very much committed to a plan-led planning system, and decisions to be made in accordance with that. We very much, you know, we seek to sort of promote. I think we have to be really positive. We have to make the right sort of messaging, and one of the things which we are again doing here in Wales is launching a placemaking charter, which will be a charter that stakeholders sign up to basically agree high-level principles about quality places. And I think we can encourage that, and I think there's very much more that can be done in order to be able to do that. I think also that you know, ultimately planners have you know, a regulatory role as well. And it's having the confidence, I think, with other professions and having joined up mature conversations about thinking about the quality of outputs rather than the processes necessarily that we go through. Sometimes bad decisions are made because of bureaucratic decisions rather than thinking about the outcomes of the places that we seek to promote. So I think, in essence, I think there's an element of actually just being positive and being really mindful about what we want to achieve. The decisions we make now will be around for 50, 100 years to come in terms of the infrastructure, and we've got to get it right.
Thank you very much. And I think the placemaking charter, the Placemaking Wales Charter, if anyone hasn't had a look at it, is really worth a look. So I know, Susan, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's just thinking about the people that use the space, and it's having that people first perspective. So, I mean, I did my planning degree over 30 years ago, and I did it as a combined degree, and I did anthropology at the same time, which bemused my lecturers because no one had done that combination before. But for me, it makes perfect sense. You know, we are planning for people, therefore we have to see it from the perspective of those people, and we need to step outside of our own experience. I said, I think that's the real problem. I said that people do design in their own image, and certainly the transport profession is 80% male, you know, and we're not thinking at it from all these different perspectives. So I think if we try and take think about how other people might experience
the award-winning
it,
Scottish Government NHS Place Standards tool
that will give us that emphasis on
demonstrates the criticality of place, which is embedded within all policy formulation. And I made reference to place in with regard to the infrastructure first approach as well. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. It's about creating places that people are comfortable in living in and working in and enjoying leisure space in, and all importantly contributes to their health and well-being as well.
John, but actually we've lost him just before I'd be able to say thank you to him. So I think it's probably come to the time where we need to wind up. And I was going to refer to one of the points he made about the decisions that we take today. They will outlive us. They will outlive generations to come after us. And so it's so important that we actually get this right. So thank you so much to our speakers. And I hope John can still hear us, but to John Fudge, to Stefano Smith, and to Susan Claris for your presentations, which were inspiring and in thought-provoking. My mind is sort of going in a whir, and there's so much I'm going to take away from what you've said. And I also wanted to thank the sponsors, Landmark Chambers and Arup, for their support. And finally, to everyone who's dialed in. It's brilliant to see such good numbers. And if you're dialing in later, playing it on sort of catch up, then do. I hope you enjoy it, and you found the presentations interesting. Now, for those who are with us today, if you want to watch it again and catch up on any bits, and I sometimes do that when I want to refresh my mind, a recording of the session will be available on the RTPI's YouTube channel, which is where you can also see the slides. And I see, John, thank you for coming back, and thank you for being part of it.